I stood at the edge of the kitchen, apron still dusted with flour, as my daughter scraped the sweet potato casserole into a trash bag. The scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey clung to the air like ghosts of a holiday that never happened. "We'll feed your food to the dogs," she smirked, laughing with her husband while the grandkids stared down at their phones. After 14 hours of chopping, basting, baking. After 3 decades of hosting Thanksgiving without a single complaint. Now I wasn't family, I was the punchline. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Marilyn's hands were stiff, the kind of stiffness that comes from hours of kneading and stirring, measuring and chopping. But even after 14 hours, the Tupperware felt unfamiliar in her hands, a foreign object she'd held too long and yet not long enough. She set it down on the kitchen counter, her fingers lingering on the lid as if she might somehow summon the magic that had slipped away during the preparation. She sighed, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. The guests still gathered in the dining room, laughed with the clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation, a sound that felt distant now. Marilyn's breath caught in her throat, as though she were still wrestling with the energy of the day, the unspoken expectations, the quiet disappointment. Jocelyn entered the kitchen with a plate in hand, and without missing a beat, she dug in with her fork. "It's cold already," she commented, not even bothering to look up. Marilyn's stomach tightened, a gnawing feeling at the pit of her gut. She took a half step toward the sink, careful not to let her hands tremble too obviously. The casserole was a lot of things. A labor of love, a testament to her patience, to the pride she felt in feeding the people she cared about. But now it was just cold and heavy. Zach's voice came from the dining room, hushed and conspiratorial. "We might feed this to the dogs," he whispered, and Marilyn's heart stopped. Jocelyn laughed. A quick, sharp sound that didn't feel real. Marilyn felt it deep in her chest, that cruel flicker of humor that didn't belong. She felt the words scrape at her insides like a knife, twisting just enough to draw blood. Guests chuckled, but Marilyn barely heard them, barely noticed their reactions. Her eyes were fixed on the casserole, the one she'd worked over for hours, the one she'd expected to be praised for. Now it sat there, insulted and ignored. Her hand trembled as she reached for the Tupperware. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to feel this small, this invisible. She'd worked so hard, hadn't she? Emma stood by the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching quietly. There was a look on her face, something Marilyn couldn't quite read, but it made the room feel colder. Emma's silence wrapped around her like a shroud, thick and suffocating. Marilyn's breath hitched as she turned slowly. She had to swallow the lump in her throat before speaking, as though her words might fracture if she didn't. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, her voice softer than she'd meant it to be. She was already backing out of the room before anyone could respond. The air suddenly too thick for her lungs. She stepped out into the backyard, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. The door creaked shut behind her and she paused, gripping the cold metal handle for balance. The moon hung low in the sky, a sliver of light that barely illuminated the garden. She sucked in a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling of unraveling. She could hear them inside, still laughing, still passing around the food she had slaved over, but it felt distant, like she was already beyond the reach of it all. She could feel the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her chest. Was it all just a joke to them? Was she the punchline? The coldness of the casserole now matched the chill spreading inside her. It wasn't just the food that had cooled. It was the distance she felt growing, stretching between her and everyone inside. The laughter, that high-pitched, hollow sound, echoed from the open window. She could imagine them sitting there, plates in front of them, acting like nothing was wrong. But Marilyn knew better. She had spent too many years learning the sounds of discomfort, the subtle flicker of tension in the air, and now it was there. "Mom?" Emma's voice called from the door, tentative and small. Marilyn didn't turn around, didn't want to see the pity in her daughter's eyes. She could hear Emma's footsteps approaching and braced herself for whatever was to come. But Emma didn't speak again. She only reached out, placing a hand gently on Marilyn's shoulder, offering nothing but the weight of her presence. Marilyn's breath caught in her throat. She had no words left. Inside, the laughter continued, unaware of the silence that had taken root outside. Marilyn stood there in the dark, her eyes fixed on the moon. A soft breeze stirred the air, but she could feel nothing. It felt like the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. Marilyn sat alone at the kitchen table, the glow of the phone screen casting a pale light across her face. Her fingers hovered above the keys, the weight of the decision pressing on her like the silence in the room. Her thumb moved slowly, deliberately, as though each letter might carry some irreversible consequence. "I want to remove my daughter, permanently." She stared at the text for a long time, the words unfamiliar yet precise, like something she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind but never dared to speak aloud. Her pulse quickened as she hit send. A few seconds passed before her phone buzzed back, and she flinched, almost afraid to look. But she did. The reply was succinct, clinical even. "Monday, 9 a.m. Bring everything." Her chest tightened. She had known Daria Lynn would respond like this, efficient, cold, businesslike. The kind of response she needed in this moment, no frills, no questions asked. Marilyn set the phone down, the reality of it sinking in like a stone in her stomach. She closed her eyes, letting the faint hum of the refrigerator fill the void of her thoughts. Her hands shook as she reached for the bottle of wine that had been sitting untouched since the day began. The cork popped with a sound too sharp, too final. She poured a glass, the deep red liquid swirling around the edges, before bringing it to her lips. The first sip burned, like fire spreading, in her throat, but it didn't stop her. She needed it. She needed something to take the edge off, to quiet the roar in her head. The front door creaked open. Wendy's voice floated in from the hallway, casual but laced with concern. "How was it?" Marilyn didn't turn to face her. She didn't need to. Wendy always asked that question, always pretending like the chaos that followed her visits could be summed up in a single, easily digestible word. "Poisonous," Marilyn muttered, her voice low, flat. Wendy paused in the doorway, then entered slowly, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, a sound that felt too loud in the tense air. "Jesus, Marilyn, what happened?" Marilyn pushed the phone toward her without a word. Wendy hesitated, then picked it up, eyes scanning the screen. Marilyn watched her closely, the words in the text taking on new meaning as Wendy's expression shifted from disbelief to something else, something darker. "Is this—" Wendy's voice trailed off, but Marilyn didn't need the question finished to know what she was asking. "Voice memo," Marilyn said softly, her fingers brushing against the glass of her wine glass. "I recorded them. Every single word." Wendy raised an eyebrow, then pressed play. The audio filled the quiet room. A series of mocking voices, sharp and biting, throwing their cruel words in all directions. Marilyn hadn't been able to stop them, hadn't been able to make them stop laughing, but she'd had the presence of mind to record it. The cutting remarks, the biting humor. "You're telling me you've got this on them?" Wendy asked, her voice tinged with something like awe. Marilyn nodded, her throat tight again. It was still fresh, the sting of it, the way they'd laughed at her behind her back, the way they'd thought it was funny. She could still hear the echo of those laughs in her head, like a mocking chorus. Wendy set the phone down, then leaned in, her expression shifting from disbelief to sharp focus. "Don't get mad. Get documents." Marilyn blinked, trying to process the suggestion. Documents. Proof. Evidence. The thought was like a spark, igniting something in her chest. She hadn't thought about it that way, about what could be done with what she had. She had always been reactive, feeling the hurt, the sharp, quiet sting of rejection. But Wendy was right. This was something else. This was the beginning of the end. I don't know if I can go through with it, Marilyn whispered, the weight of her decision pressing harder than ever before. It feels like too much. Wendy's hand rested on hers, firm and reassuring. You don't have to go through with it, not yet, but you need to prepare yourself. You need to think about what comes next. Marilyn nodded slowly, but the seed of resolve had already been planted, and she could feel it sprouting inside her, an undercurrent she hadn't been aware of until now. Later that night, long after Wendy had left, Marilyn stood by the window, looking out at the streetlights that flickered weakly in the distance. The house felt quieter, emptier now. She was alone with her thoughts, alone with the weight of the decision she'd just set in motion. She hadn't realized she'd grabbed the estate file until it was there, in her hands, the cool edges of the folder sharp against her skin. She carried it to her bedroom, the thick weight of the paper like a secret she wasn't ready to keep but couldn't bear to share. Slipping under the covers, she placed the file beside her, its contents pressing against the soft fabric of the pillow. She could feel the cold edge of it against her neck as she turned over to sleep, a small unspoken promise to herself. Her hand hovered over the file, fingers brushing against it lightly. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, an answer, a signal, a moment of clarity. But in the dark silence of the room, the one thing she knew for sure was that she had made her choice. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and when it did, everything would change. The kitchen was quiet when Marilyn finally spoke. Emma sat at the table, the weight of the world settling heavily on her small shoulders, eyes brimming with confusion and something darker, guilt. She was tracing the edge of her water glass with one finger, as if the movement might offer her some escape from the burden of what she didn't understand. "That's not your fault, honey," Marilyn said, her voice softer than she meant it to be, a lullaby in a storm. It was the kind of line a mother gives, a comfort, even if she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. Emma looked up, eyes searching her mother's face for answers, for something, anything. But Marilyn's expression remained calm, controlled, a mask she wore more naturally than she'd ever wanted to admit. She hadn't even realized she was holding her breath until Emma nodded, faintly, as if she accepted the words, but didn't understand them. Marilyn reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face, her hand lingering there just a second too long. Then, in one smooth motion, she stood up and walked to the counter. Her hands, steady now despite the unease stirring in her chest, picked up the phone. She unlocked it, tapping through her apps, until she found the one she needed. Daria's name appeared at the top of the message thread. Marilyn didn't pause. She didn't have to think about it. She composed the email quickly, her fingers flying over the screen as though writing this down would somehow make it more real, more official. List of assets. Home, 342 Elm Street, 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms. Market value, $650,000. Savings, $132,000 in Bank of America checking account. Stocks, 250 shares of Amazon, 75 shares of Tesla, 100 shares of Apple. Insurance, 1M life insurance policy. Name beneficiaries, Jocelyn and Emma. She paused for a moment after typing it all out, her eyes scanning the words as though they belonged to someone else. She almost deleted the email, but stopped herself. This was the plan now. This was what she had to do. Her finger hovered over the send button, the seconds stretching. Then, with a final sharp breath, she pressed it. Sent. Her heart didn't race. It was too late for that. It simply settled in her chest, a quiet, dull thrum, like a clock ticking away the time. The doorbell rang. Wendy's voice came through the door before Marilyn could open it. "You've got company," she called, half teasing, half worried. Marilyn opened the door and saw Wendy standing there, a folder in her hand. "What's that?" Marilyn asked, nodding toward the folder as Wendy stepped inside. Wendy's lips twisted into a wry smile. "Your daughter's legacy," she said, handing Marilyn the folder. "Clean copy of the will." Marilyn's eyes flicked over the document, familiar but with an eerie, almost detached recognition. The will that had once made Jocelyn the sole heir, that had once made everything hers. Now, it was something else entirely. A symbol of the mess Marilyn was trying to untangle. A legacy that no longer served its purpose. She ran her fingers over the page, her mind racing through every move she'd already made, every step that was now inevitable. "What do you want me to do with this?" Marilyn whispered, almost to herself. "Whatever you want," Wendy said, her voice low but solid. "It's your game now." Marilyn nodded slowly, her gaze still locked on the will. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into the abyss. But this time, she wasn't afraid of falling. "I think it's time I started my own," she murmured, turning to her desk, grabbing a fresh sheet of paper. The pen scratched against it as she wrote, carefully, deliberately, a statement of intent. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wrote something that was entirely hers. She wasn't just marking the end of Jocelyn's inheritance. She was marking the beginning of something new, something she controlled. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. Late. Too late to think straight. But still, she kept writing, sentence after sentence. Her intentions, her desires, what she wanted, what she needed. No one else would have a say in this. The door to the kitchen opened again, and Emma appeared, her face pale, unsure. Marilyn didn't look up from the paper. "Are you okay?" Emma's voice trembled. Marilyn paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. Her heart ached for the girl standing before her. "Go to bed, honey," she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll talk tomorrow." Emma hesitated, then nodded, her expression a mixture of confusion and a strange, quiet acceptance. She left without another word, leaving Marilyn alone with her thoughts and the quiet hum of the night. Once Emma was out of sight, Marilyn returned to her desk. Her hands shook, but she steadied them, grabbing the envelope she'd kept hidden in her drawer. She pulled out the medical directives. Jocelyn would not have access. Not now. Not ever again. She scribbled her name at the bottom of the page, feeling a strange sense of finality. The folder in her drawer felt heavier now, its contents pressing against the wood like a secret she wasn't sure she could carry much longer. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Marilyn didn't even flinch when she reached for her phone and ordered a small safe online. She didn't hesitate when she changed the passwords to every account, knowing she'd never again hand over control to anyone who hadn't earned it. The safe would arrive tomorrow. Everything would be in place soon enough. She would make sure of it, and this time she would hold all the cards. Marilyn stared at the photograph. It was of her from a time when everything had still seemed possible, when smiles hadn't been so hard to come by. Her hand hovered just above it, but she made no move to touch it, to acknowledge the way she looked, how full of life she had been. There was a version of her in that photo, a version that didn't exist anymore. That woman had been content, or at least she had fooled herself into thinking so. Now, Marilyn felt nothing. Her reflection wasn't in the glass. It was in the cold, hard truth staring back at her. The smile in the photo seemed distant, like the face of a stranger, not someone she knew intimately. The woman in that photo had had faith in her family, in what she thought was love. But now she knew better. The photo was a ghost, a shadow of what had been. Her phone buzzed beside her, cutting through the quiet, and Marilyn quickly wiped the dampness from her palms before answering. It was Daria. "I'm here," her voice came through the line. "Are you sure?" Marilyn glanced at the photo once more, then placed it face down on the table, as though she could erase that past version of herself. "She fed 14 hours of love to the garbage," Marilyn said, her voice steady but harsh, like the words had been living in her for longer than she realized. "That's enough." Daria arrived shortly after, her presence sharp, purposeful. She was a woman who dealt in absolutes, and in her eyes, Marilyn saw no judgment, just expectation. She sat down at the table, her hands folding neatly in front of her, as if preparing to take down an account of something she'd done 1,000 times before. "You understand the legal removal process?" Daria asked, her gaze fixed on Marilyn. "Jocelyn will be revoked from the will, trust, POA, and insurance. Everything she's entitled to will be redirected." Marilyn nodded without hesitation, the words sounding more like a plan than a choice. Jocelyn had no place in this, not anymore. It wasn't about money, it was about control, power. The things Jocelyn had taken for granted, the things she had abused. Marilyn had worked hard for those hours, those decisions, and she would not let her daughter or anyone degrade that sacrifice. "And for Emma," Daria pressed. Marilyn's lips twisted, a slight curve, but her eyes were unreadable. "I'm creating a fund for her," she said. The words measured and deliberate. "It'll be protected until she's 25. No one can touch it, not even me." Daria's brows lifted slightly. "Smart," she said, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "You're protecting her from more than just Jocelyn, from you too." Marilyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. The door creaked, and Wendy stepped in, her eyes scanning the room before resting on Marilyn, who was already standing. Wendy didn't ask how it went. She knew. "She'll never see this coming," Wendy said, her voice low, confident. "Let it stay that way." Marilyn gave a single tight nod. She wasn't worried about Jocelyn's reaction. She was past that. She was beyond the need for anyone's approval. But the cold certainty that had settled in her chest made her feel almost free. Jocelyn would never understand the price of this freedom, and that was how it had to stay. Daria stood as well, ready to leave, but before she walked out, she turned to Marilyn, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "You're sure?" she asked again. Marilyn paused, looking at the space between her and the door. She hadn't looked back at the photo of the past woman, but she knew something had shifted irrevocably. The path ahead was one of her own making. "I'm sure," Marilyn said, and she meant it. As Daria left, Wendy stayed behind for a moment, her hand brushing Marilyn's arm lightly. "You've made it clear," Wendy said softly. "Now, it's just a matter of waiting." Marilyn's gaze moved over the table, the remnants of what had been a woman and a life she no longer recognized. She stood taller now, her posture straightening in the absence of the past. The future was a blank page, one that only she would fill. And as the door clicked shut behind Wendy, Marilyn looked out the window. Tomorrow the world would shift. It would have to. There was no going back now. The phone vibrated against the countertop, the sharp buzzing cutting through the stillness of the room. Marilyn stared at the screen, her fingers hovering above the message from Jocelyn. "What time is dinner? I assume you're cooking tonight." The words, casual but dripping with an entitlement that cut deep, felt like an open wound, still raw. Marilyn's jaw tightened. She could hear the laughter in her head from just days before, when Jocelyn had casually mentioned how the casserole might be better off as dog food. It had been a joke, of course. At least that's how Jocelyn had framed it. But Marilyn knew better. She hadn't been laughing. She'd been mocked. Her hard work had been dismissed like it was nothing, and Jocelyn had made sure everyone else knew she thought it was funny. Marilyn's fingers moved, swift and deliberate. "You said my food was for the dogs. Please make other plans." She hit send before she could think better of it, before the weight of her words could sink in too deeply. She set the phone down, not bothering to watch the 3 little dots that would follow her message. She didn't need to see Jocelyn's response. It didn't matter anymore. Moments later, the reply appeared. Jocelyn's words were as smug and infuriating as ever. "Oh, grow up. That was a joke." Marilyn's lips curled into a thin, cold smile. She didn't bother typing back. Instead, she picked up her phone again, the same cold resolve filling her chest. She clicked on the voice memo app and pressed play. The sound of laughter filled the room, sharp and biting. Jocelyn's voice echoed in the recording, mocking her, turning her work into a joke. Marilyn held the phone steady as the words washed over her, her breath coming shallow, She didn't want to hear it again, but she knew she had to. No reply came from Jocelyn. Nothing. Not even a hint of apology. Marilyn stared at the screen for a long time, her thumb lingering over the send button. She couldn't make herself delete it. Instead, she forwarded the memo to Daria. Jocelyn might think she could simply laugh it off, but Marilyn knew better. She put the phone down, but the silence felt too heavy, too still. A ping broke the quiet. Marilyn's heart dropped when she saw the message from Emma. Her daughter had sent a video, and Marilyn's stomach tightened as she hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing Emma sitting in her bedroom, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted leftovers," Emma sobbed, her voice barely audible through the noise of her own brokenness. "I just wanted something. You promised." Marilyn felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Her chest constricted as the words hit harder than any of the others. She had known Emma had been hurt by Jocelyn's cruelty, but seeing her pain so raw, so exposed, made everything else feel small and insignificant in comparison. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Daria. Klaus added, "If Jocelyn challenges the will, Emma will be protected, legally binding." Marilyn didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Daria had done what needed to be done. Emma would be safe. For the first time in weeks, Marilyn felt a small piece of peace settle into her chest, like the brief calm after a storm. The night stretched on, but the weight in Marilyn's chest didn't lift. There was something about Emma's video that gnawed at her daughter's sadness over a meal. The absurdity of it all. Later that evening, Marilyn found herself outside, standing in the crisp air. She didn't know why she was here, only that she needed to move, to do something. She walked to the neighbor's shelter, a small charity she'd always felt too busy to be involved in. Without thinking, she grabbed a batch of cookies she'd baked earlier, and with them in hand, she knocked on the door of the shelter. It felt strange, almost foreign, but when the woman opened the door and smiled, taking the cookies with gratitude, Marilyn felt a fleeting moment of something different, a lightness, even if only for a moment. She smiled back, watching as the woman closed the door. For just a second, the world felt right again. When she returned to the house, she stood in front of the door, just looking at it. The familiar outline of her home felt like a farce, a reminder of everything that had been torn apart. She didn't know how to put it all back together, but she would somehow. Her phone buzzed once more. Jocelyn had messaged again, but this time, Marilyn didn't need to see it. She already knew what it would say. The phone rang again. It had become a constant, an unwanted companion. Its insistent buzzing cutting through the quiet of the house. Marilyn glanced at the screen. Jocelyn's name flashed across it, a reminder of all the things she no longer wanted to hear. She exhaled sharply and swiped the call away. She didn't need to listen. Not now. Not ever again. Her thumb moved to the voicemail tab, the list growing longer by the day. Jocelyn's messages filled up the inbox, each one more desperate, more demanding than the last. But Marilyn couldn't bring herself to open them. The words would be the same. Apologies that rang hollow, excuses, self-pity. The kind of things she had heard for years and never believed. She let the voicemails stack up, a small rebellion against the manipulations she'd endured for so long. Let her call. Let her scream. Marilyn wouldn't budge. The next day, Daria called to check in. Marilyn could hear the calm authority in Daria's voice, the sense of control she brought to everything. "Full estate shielding is in place. Home title moved to the trust," Daria said, as if it were just another task she had checked off her list. "No one, not even your daughter, can touch it." Marilyn took in the words without comment, the quiet relief settling in her chest like a long-held breath. The weight of the house, the years of labor, was no longer a burden she had to carry alone. It was safe now. Emma's future was safe. As Marilyn hung up, she turned to the stack of holiday cards on the counter. Her fingers brushed against the envelopes, the heavy weight of them sitting like a reminder of the passing seasons, the family she'd tried so hard to hold together. One by one, she sealed them. She wrote personal notes for the people who had stood by her, people who mattered, friends, neighbors, colleagues. She signed each card with care, sending warmth into the coldness of the season. But there was one envelope she didn't touch. Jocelyn's family. She couldn't bring herself to write the words. The bitterness, the betrayal, was still too fresh. Her hand hovered over the blank card for a moment before she set it down and walked away. The doorbell rang. Marilyn's heart skipped a beat when she saw Emma standing at the door, her face lit up by the soft glow of the hallway light. In her hands she held a small handmade card, clutched tightly as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "I made this for you," Emma said, her voice full of earnestness, the kind of love only a child can give. She handed Marilyn the card, her hands trembling slightly. Marilyn's eyes softened as she opened it, the words inside written in crayon, shaky but full of meaning. "You're still my favorite cook." The simple message twisted something deep inside her. She could see the pain in Emma's eyes, the weight of all the unspoken words between them. Her chest tightened as she leaned down to pull Emma into a hug, the scent of her daughter's hair reminding her of everything she'd fought for, everything she'd lost. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Marilyn whispered, her voice a raw thread. "I'll make it up to you." But Emma pulled back slightly, her eyes searching Marilyn's face. "Are you really okay, Mom?" Marilyn smiled, the strain of the day's emotions pooling behind her eyes, but she nodded. "I will be." After Emma went to bed, Marilyn stood alone in the dim light of the kitchen, the card from her daughter still held in her hands. The weight of it, so simple, yet so powerful, was almost too much. Emma would never fully understand the decisions Marilyn had made, the sacrifices she had made for her safety, her future. But one day, when the time was right, she would. Marilyn walked to her desk, opened the drawer, and retrieved the small leather-bound recipe book she'd kept hidden for years. It was a collection of her favorite dishes, the ones she'd passed down over generations, the ones that had kept her grounded. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the small chest and slid the book inside, locking it securely. She sent a quick text to Emma, her fingers steady as she typed, "Someday, it's all yours." She looked at the text for a long moment, her heart heavy but resolute. There was no going back now. There was only moving forward. The plan had been set in motion, and she would make sure Emma would never have to face the pain she had. Marilyn would keep her promise. She would protect her daughter at all costs. But as the night deepened and the house grew quieter, Marilyn couldn't shake the feeling that Jocelyn's shadow was still looming, waiting to strike. The battle wasn't over yet. Marilyn had just finished locking the recipe book away again, the familiar click of the chest latch reverberating in her mind when the phone buzzed once more. This time, it wasn't Jocelyn's name flashing across the screen. Instead, it was a notification from social media. Jocelyn posted a video. Marilyn hesitated for only a moment, a quick flicker of instinct telling her to ignore it. But curiosity, the need to be done with all of this, overtook her. She tapped the screen and watched as Jocelyn's face filled the display, that familiar, arrogant smirk twisting her lips. "Look at this," Jocelyn said, her voice playful, dripping with mockery. "My mom slaved for hours for no reason, all for a casserole. Can you believe it? Honestly, it was so bad. I'm not sure I should even call it food. But hey, it's the thought that counts, right?" The video was a snapshot of a moment that seemed to go on forever. Jocelyn's voice rang out like an echo in Marilyn's chest, each word landing like a slap. Her daughter was laughing, her friends chuckling in the background, not caring for a second that their jokes were coming at the cost of someone else's labor, love, and effort. To Jocelyn, it was all just a game, a way to rile people up, to gain attention, to feel superior. Marilyn's heart pounded as she watched, her eyes narrowing. She reached for her phone and hit record. The video was still running, but Marilyn wasn't watching it anymore. Her thumb pressed against the screen to download the clip. She paused it for a moment, watching the timestamp at the bottom of the screen, 1:02 a.m. She didn't need to think. Her fingers moved swiftly, typing out a message to Daria. Time-stamped. Downloaded. This video will hold up if she challenges the will. Within moments, Daria's reply came through. Good. This strengthens the case. Marilyn felt the weight of it, the confirmation that she wasn't imagining things, that what Jocelyn had done wasn't just cruel, it was a calculated move, one that could be used against her. The video was a weapon, and Jocelyn had handed it to Marilyn, wrapped up in a nice, neat little package. Marilyn opened her desk drawer, her fingers grazing over the edge of the folder she had started, now filled with printed messages, receipts, and other pieces of evidence, bits and pieces of Jocelyn's behavior that no one else could see, but Marilyn could. It was a collection, a record of estrangement, proof of estrangement. She hadn't meant to start it, but each new hurt, each new betrayal, had pushed her to gather it all. The emails, the texts, the subtle jabs that hadn't been recorded, until now. The video would be its crown jewel, the final item that completed the record. Jocelyn had made her bed, and now Marilyn had the means to bury her in it. As she set the video aside for the moment, another ping lit up her phone. This time, it was from Emma. I don't want to be like her. Marilyn's chest tightened. She knew what Emma meant. She could hear it in the words, the frustration, the pain. She could see her daughter, already carrying so much weight for someone so young. Marilyn's hand trembled as she typed her response, the words coming easily but feeling heavy in her heart. Then don't be, and I'll make sure you're okay. The words settled between them, but the silence that followed felt like it stretched for miles. Marilyn could only imagine what Emma was feeling in that moment, what she thought of her mother's decisions, her sacrifices. Emma didn't fully understand yet, but one day when she was older, Marilyn knew she would. She had to believe that. The phone fell silent again, but the weight of the decisions, the actions that had already been set in motion, pressed down heavily on Marilyn's chest. Jocelyn's video was a turning point, but Marilyn knew it wasn't the last. Jocelyn would never see it coming. How Marilyn would fight back, how she would take control of the situation once and for all. The future was a mess of pieces, but it was Marilyn's mess to clean up, and no one, not even her daughter, could take that away from her. But as the night wore on, and the silence in the house grew deeper, Marilyn couldn't shake the feeling that Jocelyn's next move was already on its way. The battle was far from over. The invitation sat on the counter, its crisp edges gleaming under the soft kitchen light. Marilyn had seen it the moment it arrived, the envelope a reminder of everything she didn't want to acknowledge. Jocelyn's handwriting, loopy and familiar, her name too easy to recognize, taunted her from the paper's surface. Family dinner, Sunday 7 p.m. Your presence is requested. It felt like an insult, a cruel gesture, a way to pretend everything was normal when nothing had been for a long time. The laughter in the background of Jocelyn's video still echoed in Marilyn's ears, the mocking tone in her daughter's voice, not so easily forgotten. How could she sit at the same table, pretend nothing had happened? No, Marilyn didn't respond. She didn't need to. The decision had already been made the moment the words were written on that screen, and the silence between them was louder than any argument could be. Instead, she went to the pantry and gathered the ingredients. Pies. She needed to do something with her hands, something tangible, something that made her feel like she could still control this chaos, this spiraling world that had once seemed so stable. Her kitchen was a place of solace, of familiar rituals. She mixed the dough, kneaded it, the rhythm of her movements calming the tension in her chest. She wasn't cooking for Jocelyn, not for anyone who had laughed at her. These pies were for the church pantry, for people who understood the meaning of community, of real, quiet giving. As the smell of apples and cinnamon filled the house, she began to feel, just for a moment, the quiet satisfaction of doing something kind for someone who appreciated it. The door creaked open, and Marilyn didn't look up at first. But then she felt it, Emma's presence, quiet but eager. She was standing there, holding something in her hands. Marilyn wiped her hands on a towel, her gaze flicking up to meet her daughter's. "Hi, Mom," Emma said, a little too bright, a little too nervous. "What are you doing here?" Marilyn asked, her voice softer than she intended, her hands still cold from the flour. We brought you something," Emma said, her voice dropping just slightly. Behind her, Wendy appeared, a gentle smile playing on her lips as she carried a small wrapped box. "What is it?" Marilyn asked, raising an eyebrow but smiling despite herself. Emma hurried over to the table and set the box down carefully. Marilyn unwrapped it slowly, the anticipation building in her chest. Inside was a clay trivet, small but lovingly crafted. On it, etched in neat letters, was "Grandma's Kitchen, Forever." Marilyn blinked, the rush of emotions nearly catching in her throat. It wasn't the gift itself, though it was beautifully made. It was the weight of the gesture. Grandma's Kitchen. The word stung, the soft ache of her own mother's absence filling the room. "I thought you might like it," Emma said, her voice quiet now, unsure. Marilyn took a deep breath, then reached for her daughter, pulling her into a hug. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the warmth of Emma's arms around her. She could feel the sincerity in the gesture, a quiet comfort in the chaos. After a moment, Marilyn pulled back, wiping her eyes quickly. "I'll treasure it," she said, her voice steady once again. But there was something else she knew she had to do, something that had been pressing on her mind for days now. "I need to make a call," Marilyn said softly. Emma and Wendy exchanged a look, but Marilyn didn't explain. She turned toward her desk, her fingers brushing against the paper beneath the phone. She didn't need to hesitate. She opened the document, and with one clean motion, she updated her healthcare agent. Wendy, not Jocelyn. It felt like a simple thing, but it was another step, another line drawn in the sand. Marilyn wasn't going to wait for things to change. She was going to make them change herself. As the pie crust browned in the oven, Marilyn picked up the phone and dialed Daria's number. The legal battle had never been about money, but about control, about taking her life back, about protecting Emma. "I've signed everything," Marilyn said quietly, her voice steady now. "It's all in place. The final paperwork." Daria's voice was calm, confident. "Good. Everything will go as planned. You're ready." Marilyn sat back, taking in the weight of the moment. It wasn't over. Jocelyn would never understand the depth of what had been done, but she would. The phone fell silent, but Marilyn could still hear the steady ticking of the clock, the hum of the oven, the rustling of the papers. And then Emma came back, sitting beside her as the pies finished baking, the smell filling the house. Marilyn leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the fading light of the day. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was enough. It had to be. And with each passing day, she could feel the grip of the past loosening just a little more. The task was simple, but it carried the weight of everything Marilyn had worked for. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the glow of the computer screen illuminating the room. She opened the bank's secure website and clicked through the steps she knew by heart, a series of familiar motions that, on the surface, seemed trivial, but were far from it. She began with the first account, the one Jocelyn had used for years to cover her living expenses, her shopping, her endless demands. Marilyn had allowed it out of obligation, out of the misguided belief that her daughter was still someone she could trust. She'd never realized the extent of her own forgiveness until this moment. This last line drawn in the sand. Remove Jocelyn from all accounts. The box ticked itself, the screen confirming the change. Marilyn's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. There was no room for doubt, no second guessing. This wasn't about punishing Jocelyn. This was about keeping Emma safe. She moved through the accounts one by one, removing Jocelyn from the list of contacts for emergencies, erasing her from any access to funds that no longer belonged to her. Jocelyn had never earned them, never respected them. Now, Marilyn would ensure that the girl who had mocked her sacrifices would never touch what she'd worked her whole life to build. Once she was done, she picked up her phone. Her thumb brushed against the screen, opening the email to Daria. She could almost hear her lawyer's sharp, no-nonsense tone as she typed. All steps completed. Please add financial fraud alerts under my name. Effective immediately. The words were final, and Marilyn hit send without hesitation. It was all done. The security was in place. Nothing could touch her or Emma now. Marilyn closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the decisions pressing down on her chest. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of something, relief, but tinged with sorrow. She had never imagined it would come to this. She had never imagined that she would have to fight her own daughter for what she had worked for. Her phone buzzed again. It was a voicemail from Jocelyn. "Are you mad? Or just losing it?" The words cut through the silence, the familiar sneer in her daughter's voice echoing in Marilyn's mind. Jocelyn hadn't even tried to understand what had happened, hadn't stopped to consider what she had done to get to this point. The voicemail was a reminder of the girl who still couldn't see the damage she'd caused. Marilyn didn't need to listen to it again. She forwarded it to her estate file, letting it sit there, another piece of the puzzle that was now complete. Jocelyn would have her response soon enough, but Marilyn wouldn't be caught off guard. She wasn't afraid anymore. Wendy's message came through shortly after, the tone in her words grounding Marilyn. "The trash took itself out. You just secured the locks." Marilyn smiled softly, the weight of the past few weeks settling into her bones. Wendy always had a way of putting things. The truth of it was, Jocelyn had been the one to push Marilyn to this point, to make her act. She had torn everything down so that Marilyn could rebuild. The locks were now secure. There was no way back for Jocelyn, but there was a way forward. For Marilyn, for Emma. The future was no longer clouded by fear or uncertainty. The world was wide open. Marilyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze falling to the papers in front of her. The decisions had been made. The steps were in motion. Jocelyn's next move, whatever it might be, wouldn't matter. Marilyn had already outplayed her. The phone buzzed again, but this time, Marilyn didn't flinch. It was Emma, a message blinking on the screen. "Are you sure this is the right thing, Mom?" Marilyn stared at the words, the soft ache in her chest returning. Emma didn't fully understand yet, and that was okay. But the weight of the question hung in the air, its sincerity tugging at something deeper inside Marilyn. "Yes," Marilyn typed back, her fingers steady, her heart certain. "I'm sure. And I'll make sure you're okay." The message sent, and Marilyn looked out the window at the fading light. The world was still turning, still moving forward. The past was behind her, and in that quiet, still moment, Marilyn knew that no matter what Jocelyn did next, nothing could take away the peace she was finally beginning to reclaim. Marilyn sat at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the house around her, her eyes scanning the screen of her phone. Daria's email was formal, concise, as it always was, the kind of language that made everything feel final, decisive. "Ms. Beck has removed your client from her estate. The necessary steps have been taken." There it was. Jocelyn was out. The words were simple, but they held the weight of months, years even, of struggles that no one had ever truly understood. She could almost hear the quiet sigh of relief in Daria's professional tone. This was done. Marilyn leaned back, her fingers gently tapping the table, feeling the finality settle deep inside her chest. She had taken the power back, not with anger, but with clarity. There had been no explosion, no outburst. Just a quiet decision, a realization that she would no longer allow herself to be manipulated. Her phone buzzed again. Jocelyn had replied. "What? Over a joke? This is insane." Marilyn read the message once, then again. There was no apology. There was no understanding. It was the same entitlement she'd seen so many times. The belief that everything, everyone, should just fall in line. Jocelyn still didn't get it. Marilyn let the phone sit there, the words still on the screen. She didn't need to respond right away. Instead, she stood and moved to her desk, pulling out a piece of stationery. The pen felt heavy in her hand as she began to write. Her handwriting smooth and deliberate, the ink a quiet defiance. The only thing fed to the dogs was your character. It was simple, but those words were sharp, every stroke of the pen cutting through the noise Jocelyn had created, the layers of confusion and manipulation. It wasn't a threat, it was the truth. Jocelyn had fed her own integrity to the dogs, had tossed aside the respect of those who cared about her for a laugh, for her own selfish amusement. Marilyn folded the letter, sealed it with an exactness that made it final, then placed it in the envelope with Jocelyn's name written carefully across the front. She didn't need to send it. She didn't need to do anything more. The words had already been said, in ways Jocelyn would never fully understand. Later that day, Emma returned to the kitchen, the light streaming in through the window as the sun began to set. She was quiet, but her presence filled the space in a way that felt right, natural. Marilyn smiled as she looked up from the counter where she had been working on a new batch of dough. "You want to learn how to fold pie crust?" Marilyn asked, her voice warm but steady. Emma nodded eagerly, stepping forward, her hands moving to join Marilyn's at the table. They worked together, the rhythm of their movements like a dance they had done before. It was simple, soothing. No words were needed. Marilyn showed Emma how to press and fold, how to keep the dough light, how to shape it without forcing it. They didn't talk much, just the quiet, shared moments that felt like they were rebuilding something long lost. And when the crusts were done, and the pies were placed in the oven, Marilyn felt the warmth of the moment settle into her chest. This was what mattered. This was what she had fought for. Emma would learn, would grow, and she would carry on the traditions of love and labor that Jocelyn had never understood. The phone buzzed again, but Marilyn ignored it. She didn't need to hear it, didn't need to listen to whatever Jocelyn had to say next. Then another message came through, this one from Zach. "You're insane, Mom. You made a huge mistake. This isn't over." The venom in his words hit like a punch. It was so raw, so full of anger, the kind that couldn't see past its own rage. Marilyn glanced at the screen for a moment, then placed the phone face down on the counter. She didn't need to engage. Instead, she looked at Emma, who was wiping flour from her hands with a small smile. Her daughter. She would be safe. Marilyn would make sure of it. "Every bite you mocked just built the future you lost." Marilyn's voice was soft but resolute, the words for herself as much as they were for Jocelyn. Every moment of laughter, every cruel word, had done one thing. It had made this future possible. Jocelyn had torn herself out of the life she had been given, and now there was nothing left for her but the consequences of her actions. Emma looked up, her gaze meeting Marilyn's. For a moment, their eyes held, and the silence between them spoke louder than any words could. Emma didn't need to know everything, not yet. But Marilyn would make sure she understood one day. The oven timer pinged, and Marilyn moved to take out the pies, the warmth filling the room. Everything was changing slowly, steadily. And Jocelyn, she would learn in time that the game had already ended. Marilyn wasn't playing anymore. She was winning. Marilyn's phone buzzed again. She had become accustomed to it by now, but today there was an edge to the notifications. The screen flashed a series of comments that made her pause, her fingers hovering over the device before she even dared to look. What did you do to deserve that? How could anyone treat their own daughter like that? Her pulse quickened. Jocelyn's post, the one she'd put up not long ago, had gone viral, but not in the way she'd hoped. The sympathy that Jocelyn had tried to stir, that self-righteous angle she'd attempted to play, was backfiring. The comments grew faster, more furious, as people demanded to know what could possibly justify her behavior. Jocelyn's followers, at least the ones who had previously been silent, were coming out of the woodwork, questioning the cruelty in her words. Then, a new comment caught her eye. It was from someone named Truthseeker99. Marilyn had never seen the handle before, but the message was clear. Listen to the voice memo. I found it. This isn't a joke. This is the truth. The next few moments happened in a blur. A few taps, and the voice memo Marilyn had recorded. One of Jocelyn's mocking, of her cruelty toward the dinner was out there for everyone to hear. Jocelyn's laughter, her dismissiveness, the way she'd torn down everything Marilyn had worked for, all laid bare for the world to hear. The post was no longer just a viral pity party. It had become evidence. The backlash didn't take long to gain momentum. Some users rallied behind Jocelyn, trying to defend her, but the vast majority of comments now tore into her, accusing her of callousness, of privilege, of having no regard for the years her mother had spent in the kitchen, building a life they could all share. The sympathy was draining, and what remained was anger. "This is your daughter? How could you treat someone who did so much for you like that?" one user wrote, their words a sharp critique of Jocelyn's behavior. Another person chimed in with, "You don't get to call this a joke. This is abuse." Jocelyn's panic was palpable. Marilyn could almost hear her scrambling. The comments flooded faster than she could delete, the negative attention escalating by the minute. Jocelyn's fingers would be trembling as she tried to erase the post, but the damage was already done. Marilyn didn't need to check back to see what Jocelyn was saying now. The world had already seen the truth. Jocelyn's response, her attempt to spin this into something she could control, had already unraveled. Marilyn set the phone down and exhaled, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as a calm, almost eerie quiet settled over her. She had expected a storm, but not like this. The chaos was intense, but it was outside her door, out in the world. It was Jocelyn's mess to clean up now. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marilyn walked to the kitchen with Emma by her side. There was work to do, and it was the kind of work Marilyn felt grounded in. Something real, something tangible. They baked together for a local shelter, the rhythmic motion of stirring, mixing, and measuring comforting in its simplicity. The pies and breads they made were for people who would appreciate them, for people who understood the quiet value of labor and kindness. When the last batch was placed into the oven, Marilyn leaned back against the counter and smiled at Emma, who was wiping flour off her hands, her eyes bright despite everything. They had done something good, something worth doing. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was Daria. Marilyn opened the message. "Final amendment is drafted. No appeal clause added." "It's over." Marilyn read the message, and for the first time in a long while, the weight she had been carrying felt a little lighter. Jocelyn would have no way of coming back into the fold, no way of undoing the decisions that had been made. The future, Emma's future, was secure. The oven timer went off, the scent of warm pies filling the kitchen, and Marilyn moved toward the stove with purpose. She set everything aside for now, for this brief, simple moment of peace. There was a finality to everything now, something irrevocable in the way things had shifted. Jocelyn had made her choices, and now the door was closed. Later that night, Marilyn sat at her desk, pen in hand, staring at the page in front of her. Her memoir had been a slow process, one she never truly expected to finish. But tonight, something had clicked. The words had already begun to form in her mind, and as the clock ticked away, Marilyn began to write. Chapter 7, Thanksgiving of Fire. She didn't look back. She knew exactly where the story was going. The past would stay where it belonged, and the future would be something she and Emma would build, piece by piece, from this moment on. No more fear, no more hesitation. The chapter was only the beginning, but the battle was over. The rest of their lives were waiting for them, untold but certain. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach Marilyn's doorstep, but it wasn't in the way she'd expected. The first message came from Zach, his name flashing on the screen with a text that made her stomach tighten. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I just got laid off. I don't know what to do. Can you help?" The panic was palpable in his words, a sense of urgency that rippled through the message. But Marilyn felt nothing, not anymore. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. It was all part of the same pattern, wasn't it? The endless demands, the sense that she was the only one holding everything together, only to be blamed for their failures. She let the message sit there for a moment, then swiped it away, just as she had done with Jocelyn's. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Marilyn had already made her choice, and she wouldn't be swayed. Jocelyn's phone buzzed next, the messages flooding in, one after the other. "I can't believe you do this. You're ruining me. Please, Mom, don't cut me off. I need you. I made a mistake. Please just hear me out." Marilyn glanced at the phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she'd already blocked Jocelyn's number. The action final, like closing a door that had been left open for far too long. There was no need to reply. She didn't need to listen. It wasn't her responsibility anymore. She placed the phone on the table, the weight of the silence in the room pressing down on her chest. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. When Marilyn opened the door, Wendy was standing there, her hands holding something small wrapped in brown paper. Wendy's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement, as though she knew exactly how to cut through the tension that still clung to the air. "Thought you could use this," Wendy said, with a half-smile, as she handed over the gift. Marilyn unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small plaque. Its letters etched in gold. It read, "Retired Chef. Active Avenger." Marilyn laughed softly, a breath she didn't know she'd been holding slipping out in the form of a chuckle. It wasn't the gift itself, it was Wendy's unspoken acknowledgement. A reminder that while the battle might have been exhausting, it had been worth it. She hadn't just survived, she had won. "Thanks," Marilyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." Wendy gave her a knowing look, then squeezed her shoulder before turning to leave. Marilyn stood in the doorway, the plaque resting in her hands, letting the simple truth of it settle in. Later that afternoon, Marilyn sat down at her desk, her hands steady as she typed the final updates to her accounts. She updated her passwords, a routine she'd started after everything had fallen into place. She clicked through the steps, her heart pounding with a strange mix of finality and relief. As she confirmed the closure of one account, the last thread to the past, she felt something lift, something she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The weight of Jocelyn's entitlements, Zach's demands, the quiet guilt that had lingered in her every decision, they were gone now. A final ping echoed through the quiet room as an email from Daria arrived. Marilyn opened it, her eyes scanning the short message. "Final trust confirmation received. Everything is in order, no appeal clause. It's all set." Marilyn leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting on the edge of the desk. The world outside the window had shifted, but she was finally steady. She had made the decisions, drawn the lines, and set the course. Jocelyn, Zach, all of them, the consequences of their actions had already been laid bare, and there would be no undoing them. The house felt quieter now, the space between her and the past finally still. She had done what was necessary, what was right, and finally she was free. But as she looked at the plaque on her desk, the words "Active Avenger" seemed to echo louder than the silence that had come before. There was no going back. Marilyn sat at her desk, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. It wasn't a joyful sound, more like the release of a pressure valve. She glanced at the phone in her hand. The screen filled with a message from Daria. Jocelyn's lawyer asked about the house. What should we say? Marilyn didn't hesitate for a moment. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as she typed her response. "Tell her it's out of print." She could almost hear Daria's dry chuckle from across the miles. Jocelyn's lawyer was still trying to make sense of the legal maze that had been carefully constructed around the assets. But Jocelyn would get nothing. Not now, not ever. It was done. The irrevocable trust for Emma was final, and everything had been notarized. The house was now placed in a life estate deed, meaning Jocelyn could never touch it. It was Emma's, a gift for the future, a future Jocelyn would no longer be part of. Marilyn leaned back in her chair, letting the finality of it all wash over her. The weight of the decision had lifted. leaving a strange sense of peace in its place. She had given everything she could, and now there was only Emma. The world would not be the same for her daughter. The path had been carved, and Emma's future was set. The soft hum of the room, the ticking of the clock on the wall, filled the silence. Marilyn reached for the cookbook that had sat on her desk for days, the one she had put off sending. It wasn't just a cookbook. It was her history, her mother's recipes, her own handwritten notes marking the pages where she'd perfected the dishes that had kept her grounded, the ones that made the house feel like home. She wrapped it carefully in brown paper and sealed it with a ribbon. The book was filled with everything Emma would need to know about cooking the meals she'd grown up on, but also everything Marilyn wanted to say without saying a word. When Emma arrived later that afternoon, the house was still. The smells of the kitchen lingered, remnants of the morning's work. Emma walked in, her face still bright, but now carrying the weight of understanding, of growing into the knowledge of what had been lost. Marilyn handed her the package with a soft smile. "I've been holding on to this," she said, her voice thick with the emotions she hadn't quite learned to express. Emma's eyes widened as she unwrapped it, pulling the book from the paper. The cover was worn, the edges softened by years of use. She flipped through the pages, reading the handwritten notes in the margins, some of them from long ago, others more recent. "It's perfect," Emma said, her voice quiet, a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Marilyn watched her daughter, the weight of the moment pressing down. She hadn't taught Emma everything yet, but she would. This book, this collection of memories, was just the beginning. "Promise me something," Marilyn said softly, her eyes meeting Emma's. "What?" Emma asked, her voice still unsure. "Never cook for people who mock it," Marilyn said, her voice low but firm. "Cook only for love, not approval." Emma looked down at the book in her hands, a slow understanding dawning. "I will, Mom. I promise." Marilyn's heart swelled in her chest as she stood up and walked over to the window, the weight of her words settling between them. Jocelyn would never get it. She would never understand what it meant to cook with love, to give without expectation, to create something that carried a piece of you. But Emma would. Emma already did. And as Marilyn looked out over the quiet yard, the sunlight dipping behind the trees, she knew that the future was in good hands. The recipe they couldn't steal, love, loyalty, and the quiet strength of a woman who had fought for her family would be passed down forever. The chapter was closed. But the story was just beginning. The email from Daria came late in the afternoon, its subject line bold and unmistakable. Final documentation for trust and will. Marilyn opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through the carefully organized documentation Daria had prepared. The timestamps, videos, and receipts were all there, neatly compiled into one overwhelming file, a comprehensive archive of everything Marilyn had done to protect herself, to protect Emma. Every email, every phone call, every interaction Jocelyn had ever made, preserved. The voice memos Marilyn had quietly sent to herself, the legal filings, the witness statements. Everything was here. It was undeniable. Jocelyn's attempt to undermine the trust, to challenge the will, was now reduced to dust in the face of facts. The time-stamped video of Jocelyn mocking Marilyn's casserole, the receipts for the house's purchase, the emergency medical directives, even a set of prints from their last altercation. Every move Jocelyn had made, every word she'd spoken, was now part of the record. Daria had covered every angle, making it clear that Jocelyn had no case to stand on. Marilyn felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she read through it all, but it wasn't the gloating kind. It was more like a quiet, final exhale. She'd been in a battle she never wanted, and now, at last, it was over. The next day, she received the call. Jocelyn's lawyer, unable to argue with the mountain of evidence, had dropped her as a client. No case. There was no legal ground to stand on. Jocelyn had lost. Marilyn sat back in her chair, letting the news sink in. It felt like the closing of a chapter, but there was no sense of triumph. Only the quiet, steady relief of knowing she had done everything she needed to do, and that the court had agreed with her. The ruling came quickly after. The trust stood. The will stood. Jocelyn had no claim to anything. No further contact required, the judge had ruled. Ms. Beck has acted within her rights. For the first time in months, Marilyn felt the weight lift. She wasn't sure when the tension had begun to seep into her bones, but it was gone now, dissipating with every word that confirmed her victory. Jocelyn could scream. Zach could threaten. But Marilyn knew the truth, and now the law agreed. Later that evening, she and Emma baked cinnamon rolls, the kitchen filled with warmth and the scent of fresh dough. Emma smiled softly, the quiet joy of doing something simple but meaningful washing over them both. The batter was messy, the dough a little uneven, but they worked together without needing to speak. The satisfaction of creating something real enough. When the rolls were done, they sat at the table, each enjoying a warm, sticky bite. The small victories felt sweeter in moments like this. Wendy arrived, a bottle of wine in hand. She poured 3 glasses, raising hers in the air. "To revenge best served warm," she said, her eyes twinkling with that knowing glint. Marilyn laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in weeks. It wasn't just about the justice, the final ruling, or even Jocelyn's defeat. It was about something deeper, a release. As the 3 of them shared a quiet toast, Marilyn felt a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. It wasn't just the victory over Jocelyn, it was the quiet, unspoken understanding between her and Emma. The future was now their own. Later that night, when the house had finally fallen silent, Marilyn lay down to sleep. She felt a deep, grounding sense of contentment. It was the first time in months she'd felt this way. The kind of peace that came not from victory alone, but from the certainty that everything was finally, irrevocably, in the right place. For the first time in ages, Marilyn slept soundly, the weight of the past finally behind her. And when the morning came, she knew, without a doubt, that this was the beginning of something new, something that couldn't be taken away. Marilyn stared at the email invitation sitting in her inbox, a major media outlet, eager to hear her side of the story. They wanted an interview, a chance to air the details, to turn the final pieces of this ordeal into a spectacle. But she didn't need to say a word. The paperwork, the court ruling, the documentation, it all spoke for itself. She stared at the words for a moment longer before her fingers moved, tapping the screen in a swift reply. "No, thank you. Let my legacy speak for itself." She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need anyone to tell her she had won. The victory had always been quiet, a slow burn of decisiveness and love. No need for interviews or headlines. The world would know when it was ready. Marilyn closed the phone and leaned back in her chair, a sigh escaping her lips. The weight of everything, Jocelyn, the legal battles, the chaos, was gone. In its place, there was only peace. The scent of pie drifted in from the kitchen, familiar and grounding. Emma was baking solo today, the soft hum of her movements reminding Marilyn of all the times they had done this together. Her daughter had grown into her own in ways Marilyn hadn't expected. No longer just following in her footsteps, but stepping forward in her own right. Marilyn walked into the kitchen, where Emma was pulling a pie from the oven, her face glowing with pride. Flour was smeared on her cheeks, and she grinned at her mother, a mirror of the days they'd spent baking together. The quiet hum of contentment filled the room. Marilyn didn't say anything at first. She just watched, the small joy of the moment filling her chest. Emma, her hands steady with a pie, had her own rhythm now, her own space in the kitchen. When the pie cooled, they set the table, simple but warm, with 2 small plates and lit candles flickering softly in the evening light. There was no fanfare, no need for celebration beyond this. Just the 2 of them, sharing a meal made with hands that had created it out of love, not expectation. They ate together at the small table, the kind of quiet togetherness that no one could take away from them. There was a photo on the fridge, one of Marilyn and Emma, flower-covered, grinning. It wasn't posed, just a snapshot of life as it had been, and as it always would be. Above the stove, the wooden sign Marilyn had hung years ago caught the light. "This kitchen feeds love only." The words held more meaning now than they ever had. It wasn't just about the food. It was about everything they had built, everything they had endured and overcome, together. Later that evening, Marilyn sat at her desk and clicked the button to send one final donation to the local food bank. It wasn't much, just a small contribution, but it was her way of continuing the cycle. Of giving what she had left to those who needed it, without expectation, without judgment. She wasn't giving to prove a point. She was giving because that was what mattered most. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the last few months lifting from her shoulders like an unseen burden, finally released. Her fingers hovered over the final line in her journal. She had written so much. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to fight for. The story had come to an end, but this was her final word. She said she'd feed my food to the dogs, so I fed her a legacy she'll never digest. Marilyn smiled to herself, knowing that the legacy she had created, the one built on love, loyalty, and everything that mattered, was far stronger than anything Jocelyn could ever take from her. And with that, she closed the journal, the final chapter written, and the story of her own making at last complete.